Dale has materials that he often uses, but we want to wait with that until we kind of walk through this orally, and then we may send it after we're done. So one of the first questions that got asked was, well, you know, what's the role of the board? I mean, what is the key role? What are you supposed to do?
Could we, before we do that now,
Oh, yeah.
could people just go around the room and do a hi, hello, name? You maybe know all these people, but I don't.
I was counting on their nameplates.
John did make her nameplate. It's right in front of you, John.
But just a quick,
Wow. Sure.
hi, hello, you've been on the board, X
Okay.
long, something. Just
Barry Perlman, my 4th year.
4th year, very good.
Amy, my first year.
Okay,
Lynette, my 8th or 9th
okay. How long have you been on the board, your name?
So I'm trying to think. I think it was 8 or 9 years.
year. Stacy Burwell, I think it's at 9.
Okay.
And I'm Jody Geiger, the director.
How many years?
22.
Second meeting. John, my name's John, second meeting.
Very good.
I'm Megan, 9 years almost.
And I'm Stephanie, 2 years.
Bob, and I've been on it since Jody.
22.
We all believe 22.
Very good.
Wow.
Carol, and I'm in training, I think I might get on it in January. In training.
David, 4 years.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt, Tom. Just curious.
You do that all, you do that so well. So, what do you think the role is? When you're on the board, what do you do?
I think the role is to monitor the organization through the director and to keep in mind that we ultimately are responsible for the well-being fiscally and otherwise of the humane society.
Okay, so you've got monitoring the organization and some fiscal fiduciary responsibility.
Yes.
Okay.
I just heard a term recently, Al, and Dale, that said eyes on and fingers off.
And what do you think that, what is that saying?
It's very much as Barry indicated. I mean, the role is one of oversight, but boards can be overly meddlesome too. We've got to be very good balance on it. We're blessed with having a very capable director. So that gives us a great sense of well-being. You know, I've been in organizations where that has not been. And you're forced by the rest really to become more actively involved until we find a capable director. So I think it's a balance there, and we're lucky to draw.
We are to govern, but I think one of our questions is, what does that entail month to month, or what's the hierarchy of governing? What do we not lose sight of that?
Okay. So it's really the distinction between policy, governance, and managing the organization. And you're struggling with the balance that all boards struggle with, and that is, you know, how much policy governance do we, how management involvement do we get? And there are times, as Bob pointed out, that sometimes the management side comes up a little bit, because you have to, but you got to drive that guy back down again so that you've got your fingers off and eyes on. All right, so we know the fundamental issue. It's the balance on the policy governance versus management. And you know, all of us face this in our work life, in our lives in general. Everything is a balance. And, you know, there's, you know, if we had a real, if we knew exactly how to lead, if we knew how to exactly organize every organization, we do it. But it's always a yin and a yang, a balancing act. So what we'll do, and Dale's going to talk a little bit about kind of some of the key functions, and I think that will help bring some clarity on where the eyes are on and the fingers are off.
And as we think about the role of the board, let me drop back to the question of what's the board responsible for? Or what's the board responsible to? If I'm on the board of a for-profit organization, I'm on the board of General Motors, my responsibility is to the stockholders, and generally in a publicly traded organization, that means making money.
So we're responsible for the donors in the community. to ensure that they're following the mission and vision.
All right, one option, donors and community,
Treatment of the animals.
treatment of the animals. Both interesting answers, both wrong.
Fiscal well-being.
Fiscal responsibility, another good answer.
Am I in
What?
charge of her?
That was gonna say the exact.
Charging her, well, yeah, but that's not what you're responsible for. How do you know if you've done your job good? What's the measuring stick that you would use at the end of 2 meetings or 25 years to say,
We're still here.
mission? In my mind, the correct answer to the question of what you're responsible for, what you're responsible to, the two go together on this one, is mission. So it's critical that you keep dropping back and saying, okay, we are here to further the mission of the organization. That's the ultimate measure of whether the board has done what the board needs to do. Now, all these other answers that I said were wrong, were only wrong in the sense that they're subsets of mission, so they're really right. But it's mission. Now, if you're going to make mission happen, I would contend that there are 3 functions, as Al indicated, 3 functions that a board needs to pursue, and you've got around them. Number 1 is they need to manage the CEO. They manage the executive director. They do absolutely everything that any executive director does. They hire, they develop, they set expectations, they evaluate performance, they set compensation. If necessary, they terminate, they do all the stuff a supervisor does. We'll come back to that. Number 2, they set strategic direction for the organization. It's kind of cool. You're responsible to the mission statement. You also get to set the mission statement, which is rarely do you have responsibility to do something and you get to decide what the 2 is. But you're responsible for establishing strategic direction. We'll talk about this, but I don't think the staff or the executive director can set the strategic direction of the organization. That ultimately, that needs to be the board level making that decision. Third, this is the one that most boards miss, you need to manage the board. Somebody's got to be responsible for thinking through the questions of what should be the size of the board, what should be on the board agenda, what shouldn't be on the board agenda, what are we doing for succession planning on the board, we got a board chair, you know, what happens if the board chair can no longer be the board chair, how are we doing succession planning, what are we doing to think about the board as an entity and to make sure that the board is doing what the board ought to be doing. So it's managing the CEO, managing the strategic plan, and managing the board. Now, of those, let's think about how most boards do. And this is most boards. This is not a discussion of your board yet. We'll get there. Most boards, my impression is, do a fair job of managing the CEO. But if you think about it, from an executive director perspective, this is like really strange, bizarre, and different than almost everybody else in life. The vast majority of you have a boss. There is somebody you report to, right? And so you could give me a person's name, and if they're a happy camper, your job's in good shape. Now, a few of us that have been in the academic side of the house, we're used to this concept of we report to a committee. And then you go on the other side, you're part of the committee, and then you kind of report to, I don't know who. But that it's a nebulous committee, not a boss. Back when Al used to be the dean of the College of Business, I would often, in introductions we were doing together, I would note that Al was my boss.
And I quickly disavowed that.
Yeah, Al would always disclaim any responsibility for me, which wasn't exactly a warm fuzzy, but anyway, I understand. But think about this. You're the executive director. You don't have a boss. You have a committee. You report to a committee. A committee which always speaks with a single voice and has absolute unity on what the expectations are and is clear on what those expectations are. Oh, so we're laughing.
Hypothetical.
So this isn't just other organizations. But I mean, that's the problem. You're working for a board that is changing in makeup, that isn't always on the same page, that doesn't always have the same set of priority in terms of expectation, and And boards often aren't particularly good at establishing criteria, and they're often relatively bad at doing growth and development. Maybe setting expectations, maybe giving feedback. But my experience is that most boards of these parts are pretty bad at growth and development. I'm not going to push you to asking, but when was the last time you sat down and said, okay, where do you want to be career-wise 3, 5, 10 years from now, and what can we do as a board to help you in terms of your growth and development? And my experience has been that most boards, it's like, oh, yeah, I guess we probably should have done that. But it's not stuff that happens. So I think we'll talk about it. There's some issues with managing the CEO. Second, strategic planning. This is usually a strong suit. Boards usually play some role in the strategic planning process. They talk about mission, they have strategic planning things. I assume you have a strategic planning document of some variety? And given everything you've accomplished, you kind of must have.
It's only 2 weeks.
Oh, okay. Well,
No, we've had a strategic plan
We have.
all along.
Sure.
and strategic planning is kind of tough at the board level because you need to own mission. That's yours. You own it. You tell the executive director what it is. Maybe they get to comment. High-level strategic objectives, that's pretty much a board thing. But just as you mentioned, you're not supposed to do the details. You don't do all the implementation of the strategy, right? And it's clean over here that you get control of mission. The details of how it gets done, that's clearly yours and the staff. But there's this middle ground, which I think of like having a high school senior in your house. Any of you had a high school senior in your house? Any of you would say that you were in charge of that individual? No, right? I mean, you were kind of in charge. They were still your kid, but you weren't really in charge. I mean, it's not like when they were 7. I mean, I remember when one of my kids was 7, he got all upset and he said he was going to leave home. And I said, fine. I packed him lunch, patted him on the ass, and sent him out the door. I live on 40 acres of land. What was he going to do? He was going to walk down to the treehouse, go to the treehouse, sit there, eat lunch, forget why he was mad, and come back. I mean, the boy had no option. You really don't have that with a high school senior. It's kind of a different dynamic. Well, strategic planning is like that. And that's why it's tough, because there's a piece that's got to be the board and you have to own. And there's a piece that's got to be the staff and they have to own it. And then there's this middle. And kind of, where's the middle? And this is the governance and the trade-off and the where is it? At what level should the board be involved in implementing the strategic plan and verifying it's happening? And what level would that be micromanaging? And it kind of depends on the board. Some of the work I do is in retirement communities where it's a startup, and we've got a board that's been very engaged because they're doing lots of details in building the facility, but now they've really got to shift to an operating board, which is a very different mindset, and those kind of transitions can be tough. So strategic planning tends to be the best of the group.
Yeah, in your strategic planning, one of the things that we've done is created goals for the board. But the board has some objectives that they need to be trying to achieve that will move the organization forward, usually around maybe fundraising or personal support or making connections or some metric to show that the board is in fact moving the organization.
Yes, and that's another part of what's the complexity of strategic planning is that there's a piece of it that the board may very well have to do the implementation because the board takes responsibility for some piece of the fundraising. Let's hit fundraising real quick, just as a board responsibility. Some boards have a rule that says everybody on the board needs to make financial contributions. We want to do that because we can go to other folks, funding agencies, and all the board members are committed to the organization because they write a check. Or all the board members have to participate in going out and raising dollars. I understand that, and I know fundraising people always disagree with me. I'm not a fan of either of those rules. And let me just sort of say why, and it doesn't always fit for every organization, that's for sure. It strikes me that there are some people who might be interested in donating their time to the organization, but not their money. And you can play the game of everybody's got to make a contribution. So, okay, look, give me $10 and we're going to call it a financial contribution so we can check the box every board member participates. But now what we're really doing is playing a game. If the question is, did you make a significant financial contribution? My concern was saying that's an expectation of every board member, is you're now going to have primarily old rich people on your board. Because you're not gonna have a lot of young people, because most young people aren't gonna write significant checks, because they're busy trying to figure out how to raise the family, do the kids, you know, save for their retirement, save, help the kids with college, yada, yada. And so I get nervous about separating by sort of that spectrum, and I could see where you'd have some people who want to serve on the board to be really valuable, but they're just not in the financial position where they're gonna write checks, because they're not, that's not kind of where they are in life, or they just don't have that kind of income. And in terms of the fundraising, going out and asking for money, some people are great at it. Some people are just absolute naturals. They just love asking people for money, and it just flows. And some people just hate it. Okay? I don't like asking people for money. I'm one of those people that when the school said, look, will you know, we need the kids to sell so many candy bars or something to raise money for, I was like, can I just write a check? I'll write you a check. Just tell me what the check is, and I will actually write you a check for, I don't want your damn candy bars, just leave me alone. Because I'm not going to buy them all, because I certainly don't want to eat them, and I don't want to go around selling the damn things. I just, right? And some of you, I'm guessing, are of that variety, that asking people for is just, and I don't want to lose those people on the board. Now, I would say two things. One, you might say as part of the board, we'll talk more about this when we talk about board development, you might say as part of the board, we need some people that can go out and ask for money, but we don't need everybody to. And everybody should be, in my mind, what I call a friend raiser, if not a fundraiser.
Making the connections.
Making the connection. If you don't think what we do in this building, what you do in this building is important enough and is cool enough that you talk to your friends about it, shame on you, and why are you on the board? Now, whether your friends are people who have a lot of dough or not, probably kind of depends on whether you have a lot of dough or not, might not, doesn't. But you should be willing to, and you should, just as a natural course of events, be talking about the cool things that happen here. And, you know, so you're raising friends for the organization, even if you're not asking for dough. Is that? And the third one, and this is the one that most boards just don't do well at all, is managing the board. Most boards don't drop back and think about what's the role of the board, and what should the board be doing, and what shouldn't the board be doing, and what's the size of the board, and who should be on the board, and et cetera, et cetera.
And characteristics of people who are on the board. Are there skill sets that you need? Is there create a matrix of, here are the skills we need, here are the people we got, where do we have holes, do we have some regional representation that we need, so
Exactly.
we have that filled, so you have a profile of what your board ought to look like.
And most boards don't do that. And they don't go to board members and say, what are we doing for growth and development to help you develop to be a better board member? They don't do board member evaluation and say, as a board member, John, why are you serving on this board? What do you want to get out of the deal? And now that you've been on the board for 6 months, how are you doing? And do we want to do some coaching about how you can be a better board member? Most boards don't, again, do that. Some do, but most don't. And having beat up on most boards, let me drop back and sort of, it's okay, in the sense it's not surprising. Because very few of you are sort of professional board members, and what you did professionally in your careers or do professionally in your careers usually ain't the same level as being at a board meeting. And it's just a very different kind of role. And they've changed, so I can tell the story now. But one of my first boards was Evergreen Retirement Committee. It wasn't my first, third or fourth or something, but I was on Evergreen Retirement Board. And I thought this was kind of cool. I was a young faculty member, and this was going to be kind of cool. This was now a bigger organizations, and stuff was going on, and yada yada. And I went to my first board meeting, and very early on there was a motion to buy $500 worth of sheets. Well, I don't have the good sense to shut up and vote, so I asked, well, why are we voting on buying sheets? Well, it was a capital expenditure over $500, so that required board approval. Well, why is it a capital expenditure? Capital expenditure, expected life of 3 years more. Do those sheets really last 3 years? What kind of sheets are we buying? Are those fitted sheets or not? Are those white sheets, printed sheets? What kind of sheets are we buying for these people? And we spent 20 minutes talking about these damn sheets. And if everybody just written a check, we could have bought the $500 sheets, and like if you valued your time at $1 a minute or some damn thing. But we talked about it because I was on the president of the Amro School Board, and we talked about, you know, where we got the transmission for the school board's vehicle fixed at Ralph's. Why did we go to Ralph's? Everybody knows Bob's does a better job of fixing transmissions.
So you're saying it's a trap to be avoided? possible.
It's a trap to be avoided, but it's a natural trap to walk into.
That's why you determine who sets the agenda.
That's why you gotta be careful about who sets the agenda. Most of us live at the level of where should we get our transmission fixed. We don't live at the level of setting strategy, thinking about the role of a board, etc. Only if you're some weird academic who goes to one of those meetings and says, well, that's weird, I don't think the board should do that. Do you have the free time and the luxury that you can actually do research and go back and research, well, what should a board do, and you do analysis and yada yada. I mean, that's kind of one of the cool things about being an academic, you get time to think about that stuff. And that's what came back to, and this is not me, that in the people who think about this, the National Center for Not-for-Profit Boards, that kind of thing, that there are these three things that boards ought to be doing. But in many, many cases, boards don't, because that simply isn't naturally where folks live. And I'm certainly not saying this is what happens in this case, but sometimes it's not what the boards do, because the executive director doesn't want you to. I was working with the city once on some other issue, and the city manager said, and this was a really great board member, and I asked him why. And he said, well, because this board member really never thinks. I said, what? Tell me more about this. And he said, well, look, here, one of the things on the agenda for the board meeting is buying tires for the police cruisers. I said, well, why do you have the board voting on buying tires for the police cruisers? I mean, I would think of, you know, any vehicle the tires were getting bald, that you just replace them would be the police cruisers and the fire trucks. And absolutely dead serious, the man said, if the board doesn't vote, if the city council doesn't vote on this stuff, they'll try to vote on important stuff. I believe there are executive directors out there, I'm certainly not saying you, who, let's load them up with this stuff, put it at the bottom of the agenda that they won't have time to discuss, the stuff, and keep them busy with this.
Show them the razzle-dazzle.
Show them the razzle-dazzle, and they never get around, and then they get to run the organization the way they want.
Yeah, it's amazing the number of times you see important items that have number 8 and 9 on the agenda, that the meeting's almost over, and so you have to vote on it because it's got to get done for this meeting.
Yeah, and lack of discussion. Let's think about moving this into application phase. Do you have committees?
Yes.
What would those committees be?
Executive committee,
Development.
development committee.
That's board development? Or, oh, no.
Fundraising.
Fundraising. We have a succession committee that's ad hoc, because our 3 senior managers may all be leaving about the same time.
Okay.
And we have
Board management.
board management committee.
Ooh, you have board management, that's good. Those are the 4.
Those are the 4.
Not too bad. The succession thing starts to feel a little bit like getting into operational details, but yeah, it's ad hoc, that's not bad. You've got board management, that's wonderful. You don't really have a strategic planning or an managing the CEO committee. I'm guessing the executive committee manages the relationship with
And
it.
we did have a strategic planning committee. We had a committee that developed that, and now we're kind of in the,
Implementation phase.
yes, so we're going through that, and then, yeah,
This spring it'll be 2 years old, so we'll revisit it. Executive committee.
And then who monitors the progress on the strategic plan? Is that?
the executive committee, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of executive committees. I mean, historically, why do we have an executive committee? We had an executive committee to act in the behest of the board when there was an emergency and the board didn't have time to meet. Well, I don't think that happens anymore for 2 reasons. One, if the board's doing what the board ought to do, the board should be focused on short-run emergency stuff, because you don't do short-run emergency stuff. You do strategic planning, managing the CEO, and managing the board, none of which sounds to me like a short-run emergency. And if you do have a short-run emergency, email, Skype, etc. These are the 4 people that I can get in a room quickly, and I can't get 15 people in a room quickly because it would take me too long to phone call them and try and get them all together in a room. Those days are long gone. So my bias is that I pretty much keep 6 executive committee, but I swap out the executive committee for an ongoing strategic planning committee and an ongoing CEO committee. The key point here is that your committee structure is going to drive the makeup of your board meeting. And that's why I think Al asked a critical question on how do you drive as an ongoing thing management of your strategic plan? The executive committee can do it, but if you had a strategic planning committee, which was an ongoing committee, then it could be responsible for it. The other thing I would raise on the strategic planning committee, let's think about sort of makeup of each of these three for a minute. I would look seriously at the strategic planning committee, and I'd look seriously at having non-board people on that committee. And they would be responsible for development and then monitoring the implementation of the strategic plan.
Or you can use committees as your recruitment tool.
Exactly. Let's talk about that.
Oh, a couple of the organizations that on the board or chair of the board, we have committees that we will populate with a number of board members, but some people from the community who have an interest, may have an interest in joining the board long term. And so this is a way for them to learn about the organization, for us to learn about them, and help us make a good decision on whether they will be a good board member in the future. So we use committees as a development tool for non-board members to become board members. And when you do that, I mean, you need to look at those folks the same way you look at your profile of your board. How are these people going to fit in terms of what you need in your board profile? In terms of, if you're looking at demographics, you're looking at skill sets, how do they fit? And there may be some folks who just end up being on committees and never.
Don't ever want to be on the board.
Yeah. So.
But yeah, we often think committees have to be made up of all board members. In my mind, the other thing about people, and this is very, very Machiavellian, I would admit, but
I'm shocked, yeah. I expect it.
Yeah. But the good news is I'm good at it.
Right.
I like putting people on my strategic planning committee who have money. Because my experience has been, if you go to somebody with money and say, I've got this really cool strategic plan and I really want to do this is really great stuff, will you help contribute to it? You get one response. If it's, I think you have some interest in what this organization does, would you be willing to serve on a strategic planning committee and help us figure out strategic direction for the organization?
Dale, the adage is, you ask for money, you get advice, you ask for advice, and you get money.
I've not heard that one, but yes, that says what I was trying to say better. But if you ask them for advice and you ask them to serve on strategic planning committee, then when it gets to the point where we need money, they may very well do it. And people who have money know people with money and all that good stuff. So I'm.
Yeah, I think the executive committee, actually we have one at the Grand, but it plays more the role of the managing the CEO.
And that's
really
that happens.
what it does.
Can I just mention, our bylaws require two committees, it's the executive committee and the board management committee. So obviously, if this board decides that they want to go in a different direction with committees, they have to change bylaws.
Right, sure. And I'm a fan of having very flexible bylaws.
So am I.
So I would have a bylaw that says, and the board chair shall appoint a committees as necessary to meet the needs of the organization. As opposed to deciding that we want these three committees now because this sounds right, you put it in the bylaws. Because changing the bylaws is kind of a pain. If I'm doing something where I have this huge asset that I want to protect from some people absconding with it effectively, then I'll write bylaws and make it complicated to change them because I don't want somebody to take over my organization. I think the concept that there's going to be a push to take over the Humane Society so we can gut it of all the dog food and run off with it is kind of silly. I mean, it's so I don't think you need to do that kind of a protect thing. But I think strategic planning committee, a couple board members, some non-board members, etc. A CEO management committee, and it can be the executive committee, I don't really care, other than I don't like the board chair being the chair of the CEO or executive director management committee. In my mind, the board chair has a little bit different relationship with the executive director, and I like the board chair not to necessarily be the point person on all of the feedback, analysis, etc. This is particularly important when there's an issue, there's a problem, and the board chair can be a little more, it's another perspective, it's generally a more supportive perspective. If somebody's got to raise a significant concern, that comes from the chair of the CEO Management Committee. Holding the board chair out of that relationship, because the board chair and the executive director have to do so much other stuff together, you know, public stuff, a lot of relationship stuff, etc. So I would not have the board chair chairing the executive committee for purposes of evaluating the executive director.